All right, welcome everybody to another episode of the Shadows Podcast. I'm your host, Trip Bodenheimer. And before I get started, I just want to tell everybody, if you haven't already done so, head over to our Facebook page at the Shadows Podcast. And then also our Instagram page, go over there. We have a bunch of bonus content that we've been releasing at the_shadows_podcast. But today, the 10-year-old Trip Bodenheimer in me is super excited to have. He is a former professional wrestler, host of the Man Up podcast, founder of the Man Camp, along with Lex Luger, who's another one of my heroes growing up. He is an author. He has 3 books that are out. He's a dedicated family man. He has an incredible spiritual journey. He is the Russian nightmare, Nikita Koloff. Sir, thank you for joining us.
Trip, great to be with you. And I'm just thankful. Thank you for having me on your podcast. It's an honor to be here.
Absolutely. It's a privilege to have you here with us. So before I get started, I have a couple of rapid fire questions for you. So you are a father of 4, correct?
I am. I like to say I have 4 children, all boys except for 4 of them. I'll let your listeners figure that one out, right?
Yeah, I'm the same way with 2. I have 2. So yeah, it's first question for you. What's the most cherished memory you have as a father?
Gosh, well, I'll help your listeners out. So when I say I have 4 children, all boys except 4 of them. Obviously, I have 4 girls, and so probably the most cherished memory is what those girls have taught me over the years. And the key word there would be patience. Patience. I've joked and I said I didn't swim in the Atlantic Ocean or the Pacific Ocean or the Indian Ocean. I swam in the estrogen ocean for many years. Lots of emotions for when you're raising 4 girls, and so they taught me a lot of patience and really just helped develop compassion in me as well.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'm surrounded by women in my house as well, so I can relate. Wrestlers, you always hear, especially like on a lot of the podcasts and stuff now, notorious for pranks backstage, things that are happening. What is the best prank you can remember seeing?
You know, I just recently got asked that question. It's not something you really kind of think about, and I would say, and I don't know, even when I was asked recently, I was trying to rack my brain, and I'm like trying to remember some specific pranks, or what we affectionately called in the business a rib. And I think more than I think I can give you a specific one, but more than anything, in my mind, probably the number one prankster was a guy named Rick Steiner. I mean,
really?
Oh yeah, and
more than Kurt Hennig?
Kremlin, huh?
More than Kurt Hennig?
Yeah, well, I wasn't around Kurt really. Kurt was in the WWF,
right?
And I was already departed from WCW when he came down. Now, well, you said in wrestling. If you want to go back to, okay, let's give a little backstory here since you brought up his name. So he and I, and Rick Rude, and Barry Darsow, and John Nord all played high school football together.
Yeah.
I was a sophomore. Kurt and Rude were juniors. I went and bought a letter jacket because I was confident I was going to letter as a sophomore, which I understand they don't even do that anymore. But back in the day, that was a cool thing. For those who aren't familiar with letter jackets, go Google it and look it up. It was a cool thing. And so anyway, we had an afternoon game. And so we got out of school early to go home, eat lunch, come back. I hung my letter jacket in my locker to go get my football uniform. And I came back and it's gone. And I'm like, who would have done that? Well, there's only one of 2 guys I know that would have done something like that, Rick Rude or Kurt Hennig. And in this particular case, they collaborated together. And so I went to Greg Sutton, he was the senior, the captain, and I was almost in tears, I'm a sophomore. I'm like, somebody stole my letter jacket, and I think I know who it was. And about 15 minutes later, here comes Greg with my letter jacket. I'm like, yeah, okay. Rude and Henning, right? All right. So that's pre-wrestling. So Henning was a gangster for the record. As far as in wrestling, for me and who I was around, the dog-faced gremlin, Rick Steiner, by far was the biggest prankster. But he could back it up because he had that wrestling background. So it's not like you could say or do much to Rick. You know, he'd take you down and put a crossface on you in a heartbeat, you know.
Yeah.
And I'll give you one quick prank that Rick enjoyed doing. You could be driving down the interstate at 60 or 70 miles an hour, not paying attention, and all of a sudden look behind you and being rammed by Rick Steiner in his car, pushing you up the interstate. You're not going to hit the brakes. You'd be crazy to hit the brakes.
Yeah.
He just puts it to the floor and starts pushing you up the interstate in his car, and you're helpless. You can't until he backs off. There's nothing you can do, and you'd see him in the behind the wheel like a little giggling like a little girl, like he, you know, and he just loved doing crazy stuff. So, Rick Steiner.
Okay. All right. Next one. 3 things on your bucket list.
3 things that good. Great question. The Great Pyramids of Egypt. I have yet to see those. So the Great Pyramids of Egypt. Down under. I've yet to go to Australia, New Zealand. I had not been there yet, so want to go to Australia, New Zealand, and then I do at some point. I thought I'd already have done this, but you know it's been kind of crazy, right? So, and that is I want to take maybe a month or two, get a, and I don't know that you'll even be able to do this in the future now, but I've always had a kind of a dream of taking a 30, 60 days, getting a Euro pass and seeing as many countries across Europe in that 30 or 60 days. Just whether it's one day in the Swiss Alps and 3 days in Austria or whatever, just kind of on and off the Euro train and just a backpack and just having the trip of a lifetime, you know?
Oh, I definitely got pointers for you on that one.
Definitely. Good. Well, when that happens, I'll be reaching out to you then.
Yeah, definitely have some good pointers. So you were born March 9th, 1959 as Nelson Scott Simpson, originally from Minneapolis, Minnesota. Talk to us about your childhood, like your upbringing.
Yep. Very, what I call very humble beginnings. I affectionately called them the projects or the ghettos of Minneapolis. It was, I guess the official name would have been Minneapolis Housing Authority, MHA. And we were just right off of the skyline of Minneapolis. I mean, we could, in a few blocks, just walk from our home to downtown, and which we did frequently. And so that's where life began for me. Also a family of 4. I was the youngest of 4. My mom raised me by herself. My dad left when I was around 3 years old. So I had no real male role model or male figure to look up to. I did have some older brothers, and I did look up to my oldest brother somewhat, but he was 12 years older than me, so he wasn't around long. And so anyway, around in the 5th grade, my mom was able to move us out of the projects, out to a suburb called Robbinsdale, which is where I would eventually meet Barry Darso and Rick Rude and John Nord and Kurt Henning and many, many others. And I embraced, in 7th grade, I embraced weightlifting and football. I bought my first bodybuilding magazine called Iron Man and really kind of embraced that. And I was introduced to my first male mentor, Bill Burke, who was my 7th grade football coach, who kind of knew my story and took me under his wing and really became my first male mentor.
What's something like looking back that you really learned from Bill Burke?
Well, that potentially, well, I would say generosity. And I can specifically remember, again, we didn't have a ton of, my mom was a teacher's aide, so she wasn't even a teacher. So we are on a very limited budget. Never really had a lot of money. I was a product of welfare. My dad didn't financially support my mom. So, I remember food stamps. I remember, we just didn't have a lot of money. And Coach Burke knew that. And I remember him taking me to the sporting goods store. It was pretty cool. He had a Corvette. That's probably where I got the dream of one day wanting a Corvette. He would only bring it to practice on sunny days. He would even leave practice if it started getting cloudy to take the vet home and come back with his work truck. But he took me in his car one day to the sporting goods store and told me to pick out whatever I wanted, whatever I needed. And back in those days, you wore the big arm pads and stuff. And so I didn't want to overdo it. So, I grabbed a couple things. He's like, man, get something else, And so, I was kind of embarrassed in a way, but so I would say the word generosity. Coach Burke was very generous and taking care of me.
Okay. How you mentioned that you got into football, weightlifting. How important was that for like the development of you as a teenager?
It was everything. I mean, it was. I can remember being 12 and kind of planning out my future. And when I got that magazine, I like to kind of joke, and not really though, but I was already an entrepreneur by that time. When I moved out to the suburbs, I got a paper route. So I started working and earning my own money. Then eventually I took on a second route, and it just kept growing and expanding it. But when I got that magazine, I went to an old store called Sears and Roebuck and bought a 110-pound plastic weight set. I don't know if it had sand or concrete.
I was going to say the sand ones.
Yes. It was either sand or concrete. It's probably sand. But bought this 110-pound weight set, started reading the articles about nutrition and exercise and just really embraced it and just kind of got this vision in my mind of planning life out where and I started watching football, which inspired me to go play football and meet Coach Burke. And then the dream of one day playing professional football, like many young men. And then my second mentor came into my life in ninth grade, named Jerry McFarland. Jerry was a health teacher. He was a gymnastics coach, but he was also a professional bodybuilder. And so he took me under his wing, and we actually even became training partners. I mean, he trained with me, and he had the state-of-the-art weight room at our junior high school there. He had the best weight room out of 4 junior highs and 3 high schools. He had the best weight room out of all of them. And so I feel very fortunate, to have Coach Burke, Jerry McFarland, the vision for football and weightlifting. And I lived, ate, slept, breathed it. I mean, that was my world.
Yeah. Okay. So from there, you went on to play, like you said, at Robbinsdale High School. It's like a who's who of professional wrestling, especially around that. Like one school I would have never messed with right there. Played defensive lineman, then you were all conference wide receiver. You graduated in 1977, went on to Golden Valley Lutheran College to play football, and found it pretty interesting. You played alongside Road Warrior Animal while you were there. What do you remember about that experience?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Well, and even my decision to go there, I tell people this. It was a Bible college, Just small, just kind of next door to where I was living. Golden Valley, Minnesota was right next door to Robbinsdale. The number one reason, well, two reasons why I went there. Well, maybe three. I knew 4 out of the 5 coaches.
Okay.
In fact, the defensive coordinator was a guy named Bill Burke. So from 7th grade, Bill's back in my life in my freshman year in college.
Wow.
As a defensive coordinator, and they were the number 1 junior college team at the time in the nation. And so I tell people I didn't go to learn about Jesus there. I went because of football, you know.
Yeah.
But and then I in turn would be the one, if you want to say, responsible for making the phone call to recruit Animal out of Irondale High School in New Brighton, Minnesota, to come play ball with me. In fact, I can still vividly remember the night him and his mom and dad came to tour the campus, and I chaperoned them around, and we just clicked and hit it off and became the best of friends.
Wow. Yeah, and then it was pretty interesting twist to the story a little bit later on about how he ends up recruiting you. But you get injured, you suffer an injury while you're there, and then rehabbing, you start attending Minnesota State University Moorhead, and you suffer a shoulder. Was it a shoulder injury there?
No, actually. So these were some potentially pretty major setbacks. My freshman year, for those who are avid football fans who might remember, this is kind of ironic too, Joe Theismann, when Lawrence Taylor fractured Joe Theismann's leg in a game.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, do you know, I actually verified this when their last Alex
Smith. Mm-hmm.
Do you know, same team, same injury, literally same day, like November 19th, really? Theismann fractured his leg like in 1980 something. Alex Smith fractured his leg November 19th, 2000 and something.
Wow.
Same day, same team. Yeah. Now, obviously different opponents, but just that's a weird little fact for your following, right? But all that said, I predated Joe Theismann. I fractured my right leg my freshman year. Many thought it was career-ending for Joe Theismann. Now, Alex is 17 surgeries later is trying to come back, right?
Yeah.
Fortunately, I didn't have 17 surgeries, but I came back. And when I was told I would never be able to play again, by my old high school football coach, by the way, who I never really like anyway. But that was motivation for me. Came back and played, only to fracture my other leg my senior year in college.
Wow.
So not one, but 2 identical fractures to each leg. And I like to say they were setbacks, but I didn't allow them to hold me back. I used them as motivation to come back.
Yeah, and that's really important too, because I was just talking to someone yesterday who's encountered a setback, and you can't see what's ahead necessarily at the time. It's only like what's right in front of you. For you at such a young age with a setback like that, and you've had a dream of playing football professionally, what did that do for you mentally at that time?
Yeah, well, let's take the first one, because I was only 18, right?
Mm-hmm.
I was an 18-year-old punk kid. And I can remember, and there's a cool follow-up to this story that I'll quickly share with you and all your listeners, Trip. I'm 18. I'm laying on the field. I know what my dream is. I'm laying on the field, and I can vividly remember thinking, and I knew my leg was shattered, because when I looked, I sat up and looked. I mean, from below my knee down to my ankle, my leg was in the shape of like a Z, right? So it wasn't like the L that it normally should be. It was had a different alphabetical letter. So I knew my leg was shattered. And I can remember laying on that field in my mind thinking, my leg is shattered, my dreams are shattered, my career is shattered, my life is shattered. And thankful to a dear, dear friend of mine, Tim Peltier, still the longest friend to this day. He was our quarterback, not only in junior college, he was my quarterback in high school as well. And that was kind of a factor why I went over there too. But he kind of nurtured me through those 17 days in the hospital and helped in my mentally helped me get through that. And then eventually I was motivated. I've been pretty much a self-motivator most of my life. I was motivated to come back from that injury. And here's an interesting quick part of that story. That was in 1977 that happened. And in 2018, I have a brother-in-law who's retiring from work, who happens to live and work in a little town called Thief River Falls, Minnesota, where I broke my leg my freshman year. He's got a retirement party. So I fly into Thief River Falls. My brother and my brother-in-law pick me up. We first go by the little hospital they took me to, which is where he actually worked, the hospital where they took me during the football game. Then we went over to the stadium, and I was able to get in. They were having practice. I was able to get in on the field. I took a bunch of pictures on the field. I got down in my three-point stance, had some photos taken, and walked off that field where I had 40 whatever years earlier, I got carried off the field.
It's really cool.
Yeah. So there was some real, I like to say, some real closure that I had the opportunity. I feel the Lord gave me the opportunity to have closure to what was a very traumatic time as an 18-year-old.
That's an awesome story. I appreciate you sharing that with us. So after that, you end up being recruited. Scripts kind of flip on you. You end up getting recruited into pro wrestling. Tell us about that story.
Yeah, so it did get. That's right. It got flipped. Animal doesn't finish college. I do. He doesn't. He ends up getting married and having a baby and his first child and then next thing I hear is he got into pro wrestling. I'm like, oh, that's cool. And then I can remember graduating from Morehead State. Graduated. I can remember you and I were talking, I think before we came on air about, and I love your introduction, by the way, the 10-year-old kid in me. You know how many times I meet people that are like, dude, I feel like I'm 14 again, or or whatever, 9, 10 years old. And then the 605 Superstation, right?
Oh, yeah.
Night. And I can remember going over to Joe's house, his parents' house, or sometimes we would go to a restaurant where they had TBS or whatever and ask them to turn on championship wrestling, and so I'd watch it with his parents, and it was kind of fun, pretty cool. And then just fast forward, condense the story. I'd randomly get a phone call one day in 1984, in the spring of '84. And he laid out this storyline. He had been approached by Don Cornotto, who was Ivan Koloff's tag team partner. They were the world champions. And Don asked him this, hey, Animal, do you know any big guys who wouldn't mind shaving their head and becoming a Russian?
Of course. I know.
He's like, I know the guy right now, So he calls me and shares the storyline with me of the nephew for Ivan. And I said, Joe, do they know I have no amateur background and no professional training? I've never been in a ring. Because I told them, they said they didn't care. I go, really? I go, so what do I need to do? He goes, well, call this promoter in Charlotte, Jim Crockett. I go, okay. So he gives me the number. I call. Jim Crockett gets on the phone. I only have a 5-minute conversation with him. I introduce myself, and I'm like, now, Mr. Crockett, you understand I have no amateur background, no professional training. He goes, yep. I go, and you're okay with that? He goes, yeah. I go, so what's the next step? He goes, be in my office on such and such a day with your head shaved bald. I go, that's it? He goes, that's it. Okay, see you then. That was it. That was our conversation. I never had another conversation with him till I rolled into Charlotte, North Carolina, the day he said to be there with everything I owned to my name, which wasn't much, and introduced myself. He took a look at me, introduced me to Ivan and Don. Nikita Koloff's born in the hallways of Charlotte, North Carolina in 1984.
Wow. And one thing that I think is incredible about your journey is my wife, she'll sit there if I'm watching wrestling, and she'll, she knows some of the characters, but I was telling her about your story, especially the whole kayfabe, which is, keeping it real around the crowd and stuff. And it's just a remarkable journey as a whole, because you embraced that character. You had to learn to speak Russian. Talk to us about that in the 80s, because now, there'd be an app you could pull up and it would probably be really simple. But how in the world did you accomplish all of that?
Yeah, it is. That's a great question, because you're right, because I've actually done this. I'm like, how do you say this word in Russian? Do you just go to hit Siri or whatever, right? It just gives it, just says it. Well, yeah, there wasn't that easy access back then. So I got my hands on a Russian workbook, a cassette tape. And if some of your listeners don't know what that is, just go Google that, a cassette tape. But I got a cassette tape, learn Russian in 30 days or whatever, and this workbook, and I signed my name in Russian. Now, I never became fluent in Russian at all, but I could. In fact, I was speaking. I was doing some ministry a couple of weeks ago, and there was this international basketball team there, and this young kid from Russia, and he's like, "Do you know any Russian?" I go, "Well," "How about dia?" He goes, "Oh, that's uncle." I go, "Yeah." I go, "How about Bajalosta?" And he said a little different way, but he goes, "That's please." I go, "How about Adin, Dava, Tre, Shetre, Fiat?" He goes, "Oh, you're counting to 10, So there was a little bit I learned. And I figured, Trip, I learned enough to fool the stinking Americans, and then of course sign my name in Russian. And believe it or not, I had somehow I found the subscription to Pravda magazine. You ever heard of that?
No.
Pravda magazine was a Russian propaganda magazine. It was in English.
Oh my God.
But I subscribed to that because I thought, well, when my mail carrier brings my mail, he's going to see the name, see Pravda, and go, wow, this guy really is from Russia. So when you want to say I took it, I mean, I even went to the phone company, the power company, to the management office when I first got my apartment, and we gave the same story everywhere. This is my nephew. He doesn't speak any English. I'm going to co-sign for him. Wow. And in my mind, I'm like, if I really was from there, how would such and such a word sound or a sentence sound or what? And so I took about 6 months and didn't speak English anywhere in public at all, and just built the story in my mind.
Yeah, it's two things about that. First, I grew up, like you said, watching you cut promos as the Russian Nightmare. And then I think the first time I had heard you do like a shoot interview, I was like, that's not how he sounds. That's not right.
Right. Wow, he's mastered the English language.
He's really mastered the English language. Very kudos to him. But then the other thing that I think is crazy, and for our listeners who aren't necessarily a pro wrestling fan or have never watched it, you watch Nikita Koloff and you embrace that character on screen and off screen. Christian Bale is not Bruce Wayne when the camera is off. He is Christian Bale. So I think that's one thing that is crazy about pro wrestling is how much these, like The Undertaker, embrace this character out and about in public. So that story is not even done. I got to ask you about this one that I heard. There was an incident in Kuwait at with the Russian embassy.
Yes. It was kind of crazy. I look back now, I'm like, I wish I would have handled it a little bit different. But so the ambassador for Russia, who's to Kuwait, we're going to do a 10-day tour in Kuwait, but interesting, all at the same stadium. So we didn't have to travel anywhere, but we're going to wrestle for 10 nights in a row. Well, advertising is up everywhere, right? All over the city and around the country of Kuwait. And, hey, come to these pro wrestling matches. And the Kuwaiti ambassador, or the Russian ambassador, sees the advertising. So he reaches out to the promoter over there, the local promoter, and goes, because, I got the hammer and sickle on my tights, like CCP headband on. And he's like, who is this guy? I mean, if he's from Russia, we want him staying at the embassy. Which I was like, I ain't staying at no Russian embassy. I may never get out of the Russian. But, and he goes, and if he's not, why is he pretending, an imposter? So he's, and so the promoter had to smarten him up to the fact that, no, this is just a persona, a character. So then he got mad, I guess, right? He goes, well, I want all those headbands and the hammers. I want it all blacked out, on every advertising you do, or whatever. But I found out the opening night, I'm in the dressing room and they come down and they go, hey, just want you to know the Russian ambassador and his wife are out in the stands. And I'm like, what? They're like, yeah, they came to the matches. They're here tonight. And so the kind of a crazy part, over here in America, I'm the #1 most hated guy in wrestling by fan polls, right? I walk out to the ring that night and I get cheered. And I don't know what to do. Look, I'm a bad guy. I don't know how to be a good guy. But fortunately, I'm wrestling a guy named Sergeant Slaughter. Well, Sarge walks out and he gets booed. Like, for real. And I'm like, okay. So we get in the ring. I'm like, Sarge, dude, I don't know how to be a good guy. He goes, just follow my lead, kid. Follow my lead. I'm like, yes, sir. You got it. And I ended up getting my hand raised. I won the match. The crowd cheered. The Russian ambassador and his wife went home happy.
Wow. That's a good story.
Yeah, crazy story.
Yeah. And talk to us about the crowd. You kind of hinted at it right there, but especially in the Crockett, like Southeast region, some of those hostile crowds. What's one thing that really stands out to you is, I don't think I'm going to make it out of here?
Well, there's a couple of thoughts. One, I'll give you one. Being, which, by the way, I think I thanked you before we came on air, but thank you for serving our great nation.
Absolutely.
And all the guys that you work with. You may or may not appreciate this story, but Fayetteville, North Carolina, Fort Bragg.
Clash of Champions.
Well, not just the class.
Yeah.
It wouldn't even had to have been that. It would have been Ivan's interviews, Uncle Ivan interview, and we're cutting a promo for Fayetteville. And he would say something to the effect, and I want to see all you soldier boys in the front row wearing your yellow dresses. And I'm like, really, Ivan? Like, for real? Like, yellow dresses? I'm like, you're going to get us killed, dude. And so, for the record, all those soldier boys, they'd be in the front row. They were not wearing yellow dresses. And they let us go real quick. We were #1 in their hearts. So that was always interesting, wrestling in military towns. And then as a bad guy, as a heel, sounds like you've done your research, but I had 6 different matches where fans actually came over the barricade after me. In fact, the very first one, my first ever match against Flair at the 85 American Bash, your listeners go watch the old clip and you'll see the fan get in there. He actually gets in the ring, gets his hands on. And I didn't know, I never thought about, and it didn't dawn on me till, it took me a second to go, who the heck is this? I'm like, oh my gosh, this has got to be a fan, That happened 6 different times. And then another military town, one other quick story, Charleston, South Carolina.
Yeah.
Crockett comes to us one day, he goes, hey, we just want you to know, we got some death threats, that if you and Ivan show up in Charleston, they're going to kill you, but you'll be all right. We'll beef up security. You'll be fine.
Sure.
Right. Well, and I'm like, I'm 10 foot tall and bulletproof, right? So I'm like, whatever, who cares, But in my mind, I'm 10 foot tall and bulletproof.
I heard you got hit by a spark plug somewhere.
Puerto Rico.
Someone and it cut your arm or something like that.
Absolutely. I'm walking to the ring, and all of a sudden bang! I feel something like hit the back of my arm. I'm like, ow, that kind of hurt. And so I put my hand on my arm. And when I pull it back, there's blood on my hand. I look down, there's a spark plug laying on the ground. I'm like, oh my gosh, those kids used to sell bags of rocks outside the stadium to throw at the bad guys. Like, for real. It was crazy.
Different time. Definitely a different time.
Yes.
So another thing that stands out is the, listening to, Something to Wrestle or all these other podcasts. The car rides that y'all would have up and down the roads were like moving classrooms. Talk to us about some stuff you learned in those long car rides you had.
Yeah, especially in the early days and the early beginnings, because again, no wrestling background, right? No training, none, like zero. Like my debut was in the Dorton Arena in Raleigh, North Carolina, and Crockett wanted us there early, but we got there late. It wasn't my fault. I was just along for the ride. I didn't know what's going to happen. We get there late. We didn't really have any time to get in the ring, so they really couldn't show me anything. I think he started having second thoughts, but Ivan, to Ivan's credit, Ivan talked him into still letting me debut. So they taught me how to tie up and lock up and stuff in the dressing room. A couple basic moves, and fortunately for me, my first match only lasted 11 seconds, so I was very fortunate for that. And I was told by Ivan, don't trip on the ropes, or I guess Crockett said, I'm history. I'm gone, out of here. And so I'm like, okay, don't. And I said, how hard can that be? But if you've never climbed in a pro wrestling ring, it's harder than you might think it is if you've never done that. And so that I'm like, don't trip on the ropes. Don't trip on the rope. Kept repeating myself, and I didn't. And then we get to the towns, for the next 2-3 months, and 2-3 hours early, Ivan and Don and I, and they'd bump and thump all over the ring, teaching me the mechanics of wrestling. I'd have a very short squash match. Ivan would sit in my corner. I'd sit in their corner for their world tag team title defense. And then on the way home every night, we would discuss old school psychology of wrestling, a lost art that's no longer there. But the art, why they did what they did, when they did it, how to draw the fan into this, that, or the other. So fortunately for me, I was a quick adapter, and I was able to kind of gain that understanding, that knowledge, and then apply it each night that I go out the next night. And yeah, so on the job training, so to speak, a moving classroom. You were right. And by the way, we averaged in those early days 2,000 to 2,500 miles a week in a car.
What's the most matches you wrestled in 1 year?
454, 1986.
Math definitely adds up well. So 2 a days and 0 time off on that. Gosh.
Lot of matches. Lot of matches. Especially we throw TV matches in, TV tapings and stuff, because you could have 2 or 3 matches in one night on a television taping night.
Yeah. My dad and I went to a back in the day WWF TV taping in Charleston, and it was like 6 hours. And
yeah, marathon, right?
The marathon, and you'd see the same guy come out 3 or 4 times, taping all the syndicated shows. So
yep.
Another thing that I talked to you before we hit record about this, for me as a fan, the Magnum TA series that you had was incredible. But talk to us about that car accident he got in, how that changed, the landscape of Crockett, and it was a very unfortunate end to like a very, very, very promising career.
It was. It not only changed the landscape for Jim Crockett Promotions, changed the landscape for Nikita Koloff. Because, and by the way, that's the most often referenced part of my career, the Best of 7 series. against Magnum TA. In fact,
really good.
Recently on Twitter, they were talking about some other, I don't even know the names, honestly, but it was like a best of 5 series or something. But the comment was, hey, if you really want to see, one of the best ever series, go watch Magnum TA and Nikita Koloff best of 7, so flattered by that. But that said, most often mentioned, and again, a tragic ending, as you said, to a very promising career. He was being groomed to be the world champion, and we had great chemistry with each other. And I look back, and who knows? There's a lot of what ifs, shoulda, woulda, right? But what if he hadn't had the wreck and got injured? There's a pretty good possibility Nikita Koloff never would have become a fan favorite.
Yeah.
And him and I would have had, I believe, matches for 2, 3, 4, 5 years back and forth for belt, not just the two, but on and off for the world belt, for flag versus flag, chain matches, cage matches, and everything else, because we just had great chemistry and a great relationship with each other. So it not only changed the landscape of Crockett Promotions, it changed the career of Nikita Koloff.
Yeah. You changed your name legally to Nikita Koloff. What made you go through that process?
Again, in my mind, I didn't know at the time. I learned later on kind of what I was doing. Just like I didn't dream of being a wrestler, or wasn't looking for the opportunity of wrestling. There's a number of things in my life that has happened with now. But the term I came to learn it's called method acting. Method acting. And because I didn't take acting lessons either. I mean, I believe it or not, I used to skip class when I thought I had to speak in front of the class. I mean, back in high school, like for real. And so again, as part of my projecting myself into this character, I guess I became a method actor. And so changing my name legally was just a part of that, because I felt like eventually I'm gonna get stopped by a cop, speeding down a highway or something here in the Carolinas or somewhere, and I'm gonna fly in an airplane. And the more my character got over, the more exposure I had. I didn't want somebody to look at my driver's license and go, "Oh, that's not even your real name," So they'd look at it, and because I always stayed in character, they were more convinced, even like you said, to watching that first interview going, wait a minute, where's his accent? Oh my gosh, his English has improved. So in my mind, that was just another piece of of fully getting that persona over.
And you kind of went in and out of WCW from the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. You had some stuff going on in your personal life around that time. Between everything that was going on in your personal life and then just the toll of being on the road, wrestling 400 plus matches a year, traveling from town to town, what kind of toll did wrestling take on you emotionally, mentally, socially, spiritually?
Well, I'll start with the spiritual. I wasn't walking with the Lord. I didn't have at best. I understood the story in my head that there's a man named Jesus. That I went to church a handful of times. I didn't grow up in church, so I didn't grow up in Russia. But I knew the story. This man was crucified on a cross with spikes driven through his hands, his feet, spear through his side, rose 3 days later. So I knew that story. So spiritual, there wasn't a whole lot of effect spiritually per se, although I can see the hand of God orchestrating my life even when I wasn't serving him. Mentally, emotionally, it was challenging. For those who don't know, I was dating a gal who was diagnosed with cancer at the age of 24. And she battled it for 2 years. She would eventually pass away at the age of 26. So mentally, emotionally, that you might think, well, that would draw a person to the foot of the cross, but it didn't. It was a step in the process of eventually coming to the foot of the old rugged cross. But it was my first introduction at the brevity of life, how short life really is. or how short life can be, mentally, emotionally, and of course, physically, that business is very demanding physically. And of course, I still into weightlifting, heavily into weightlifting, all through my wrestling career, and in a routine and a groove to stay physically fit, eat healthy. And so I was in and out. 'Cause I did officially step down, walk away, really in the prime of the career, the main event wrestling. Right, I just felt it was only right, as life grew shorter for her, to go home and take care of her. And so I took, if you want to say, a leave of absence or a sabbatical, to do that. They weren't happy or thrilled about that, believe it or not. But nevertheless, that in my heart of hearts, that had to be a priority. She had to be a priority. And I eventually went on to marry her just a few months before she passed away. Just felt like that would bring some hope for her in that. And as we got married together and spent those last few months together. And then, as you said, I would then go back to WCW, but the business was different, and they honestly treated me different after that, as well. So, I don't know how much you want to talk about that, but they did. So
the one thing I wanted to ask, kind of as a follow-up to that one, and you'd mentioned your wife, Mandy, which I appreciate you sharing that. But also some of the guys we mentioned earlier, like Rick Rude, Kurt Hennig, Tom Zink, you went to school with. Those guys have all passed away, along with Joe Laurinaitis. We were talking about Road Warrior Animal.
Hawk.
Hawk passed away. I mean, just so many guys from that time, and from my childhood, watching wrestling. But you were really close to all those guys. So some of us maybe lose, for most part of our life, lose one or two people. But yours is a handful. How have you, especially before you opened your heart to Christ, how did you really, cope with that?
Well, it's a great question. And in fact, somebody just on social media messaged me the other day, and they go, "Oh my gosh, you and Paul Ellering are the only two left from the War Games." I was like, wow, that's true, from the days of the Road Warriors and the Superpowers, right? And so I guess in one sense, Trip, we asked how I coped with that. So because of the experience with Mandy and what I saw her suffer through chemotherapy and radiation, losing all of her hair, buying her wigs to help her maintain a semblance of her beauty, and to help her mentally and emotionally, that once these guys started passing, fortunately for me, it was heartbreaking to hear some of them, Kurt Hennig's story and, the hotel in Tampa, or, Rick found on by his wife on the living room floor, one morning. And so most of them have happened since my encounter in my walk with Jesus. So I have a better grasp on and understanding of death now. And for the few or the handful that happened prior to my salvation, the death of Mandy helped me better understand death, if that makes sense, I guess, for your listeners.
Okay. No, I appreciate you opening up with that. And you found faith in Christ on 17 October 1993. You had already stepped away from wrestling a year prior after an injury. How did that day become the day where you were like, this is the day that I'm going to really change my life?
Yeah, a divine appointment is the only way I could really one way I would phrase that, a divine appointment. And again, there's a number of things in my life that parallel that. I wasn't looking at getting into wrestling, but the door of opportunity opened up. I wasn't looking at being an evangelist, a minister, travel the world, sharing the gospel, telling people about Jesus. But I was in a season where I'd left wrestling under my own terms. So again, and for those who, I'll just mention why it's on my brain. This is how my brain works. for your listeners, I actually just launched a brand new website, Koloff.net. There's 2 books on there, one motivational, one inspirational. The Nikita Tale of Ring and Redemption is my life story. For those who maybe want to hear more details of my story, they can order it right off the new website. But I wasn't really looking for that, but I'd met this Christian couple through business after I left wrestling, and I left under my own terms. Again, at the age of 33, very unusual, just like the way I broke in was unusual. Now I'm leaving wrestling in a very unusual. In fact, Lex Luger, you mentioned Lex. Him and I do a lot of ministry together. We do camps. He's man camp, and we've done a lot of ministry together. He'll tell the story when we're together sometimes. Like when he first heard I was leaving, he's like, "What's that guy, an idiot? Was he crazy?" Because wrestling went from making a handful of dollars to these guys making multiple millions of dollars. So for your listeners, I want to understand, I walked away from that. I walked away. The guy who essentially came and took my place, a guy named Bill Goldberg, they signed him to a $3 million a year contract.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't make that my entire career, let alone per year. And so I literally walked away from millions of dollars, which is why Lex thought I was an idiot, But little did he know or I know that 11 months later, in this pursuit of what life held next for Nikita Koloff, I would say it this way, Trip. I was successful in many people's eyes and even my own, but I was unfulfilled. I'm like, I climbed the ladder of success, achieved this worldwide level of fame on a small scale, but yet I'm still unfulfilled. And then I'd met this Christian couple through other business ventures, and they had invited me to their church. And then the divine appointment is I just called them up one day and I said, "Hey, I'll be there Sunday." And that was the first time I'd ever walked through the doors of that particular church. And when an invitation, what I know is now is an altar call, was given, in my heart of hearts, it was my aha moment. Like, man, I know what's missing. Remember that story I knew in my head about this man, Jesus? Well, that day, Trip, that story made the trip from my head down to my heart. I encountered Jesus that day, and honestly, life has never been the same since.
Yeah, it hasn't, because you've been doing some amazing things. I see the shirt that you got on now, Man Camp. If you don't mind, fill us in on what is Man Camp.
Yeah, just real quick, for men 18 years and older, Lex and I co-facilitate this camp, and guys come in. We got a property, about a 100-acre piece of property in northern Georgia that we rent there. We do one in the spring, one in the fall. Our next one will be in April. Just go to mancamp.info, INFO, mancamp.info. And what God gave us this vision back in 2015. He lived with me for about 10 months. And out of that time, birthed this vision for these camps and a one-day conference I do solo called Man Up. I bring that into churches, communities, just a Saturday conference. I usually stay over and preach. And that's kind of the appetizer. The Man Up conference is kind of the appetizer. It's not a prerequisite. I mean, we have guys who don't go to the conference, just come directly to the camp. Like, we already have guys signed up from Nevada, from Louisiana, from Wisconsin. Wow. Guys come from all over the world. We've even had guys come from Europe. I know you spent time in Europe.
Yeah.
Just word of mouth. And it's guys who have a hunger for more of God. They just want to go deeper in the relationship, or maybe they don't even have a relationship, but they want to go deeper and encounter God in new ways. And so it's based on 1 Thessalonians 5:23, being whole in spirit, soul, and body. And so what Lex and I have done, combine our years of experience together. We talk about eating healthy. We talk about exercising. We do some very simple outdoor activities at the camp. We talk about being mentally and emotionally healthy. We talk about being spiritually healthy. And our goal, Trip, is to send men back home. For your lady listeners, if you give your men your blessing to come to this camp, our goal is to send them home better equipped to be godly men, godly husbands, and godly fathers. That's our goal.
That's awesome. And
Yep.
it's good to see Lex Luger doing that too. He's doing
Yeah.
so, I mean, it's incredible to follow along and see what he's doing. You've also written 3 books, which definitely tip my hat to you for that. So tell us, the listeners, about your books that you have out.
Yeah, which is funny again, because I hated English in high school. So the fact I'm writing books has to be a God thing. I'm
You just
saying.
learned English not too long ago. So yeah.
Right. So now I learn English. I learned to write in English and write some books. So yeah, I've written 3. I'm working on a 4th book right now to be a little bit the others. The first one, I'm actually going to go back and do a remake on that. It's been on circulation for a while. It's time to do a remake on that. But the 2 that are on my website, Wrestling Success, Developing a Championship Mentality, that's motivational. If you want to be motivated and challenged, then get that book. Go on my website, go on koloff.net, get that book. If you want to be inspired, then go get Nikita, A Tale of the Ring of Redemption. I like to say this. My whole story's in there, but William Murdoch, who did it with me, is a wrestling historian. So if you're an avid wrestling fan, and I know some of your listeners aren't, or if you want to learn more about wrestling, we weaved a story within a story. William goes back to the 1800s of the history of wrestling, and we tell that story along with my own story of how I got into wrestling and then life after wrestling as well. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and definitely keep us posted on that 4th book that you have coming out.
Yes, sir.
You're also into podcasting. Did now I have to ask, did wrestling, being in front of a mic for so long, talking in front of large audiences, did that kind of plant a seed when this whole podcasting thing came up with Man Up podcast?
No, so here again, this is crazy. I wasn't looking at being a podcaster.
Mm-hmm.
I was looking at, like, it actually airs on radio, on Truth Radio Network in Richmond and Petersburg, Virginia, in the Triad, the Triangle, Charlotte, Gastonia. So it actually airs on the East Coast on radio first. And then it's uploaded to all of the podcast platforms, right? But the Stu Epperson, the owner and CEO of Truth Radio, reached out to me last year randomly. I only met him a couple of times. He goes, "We need to talk." So he drives down to my house, spends 3 hours at my house. He goes, "You need a weekly radio show." I'm like, "Oh, okay." So I never thought about getting into radio or podcasting, honestly. Just like, didn't think about being a wrestler, didn't know I'd be a Christ follower, didn't know I'd be a podcaster, right? And so I prayed about it. He prayed about it. I felt confirmation, and for this reason. In my mind, I felt like I'm supposed to reach a certain number of countries. Now, I've literally traveled so far to 30 countries,
mm-hmm.
and I've been to all 50 states. But I thought, how can I gain more ground and reach more people? How can I expand my message and my story? And it was like, again, airwaves, technology, radio, podcast. So last September we launched. It's called the Man Up podcast, but it's time to man up. And we don't just have men listeners; we have a lot of lady listeners as well. But already, this is kind of a cool story. Already in a short period of time, it's already been downloaded into 30 countries so far, and we've got some really cool. And I don't just interview wrestlers. Like, I did a 2-part series with Sting.
It was really good.
Tremendous feedback on Lex Luger, Monday Night Raw guy named Jackson Riker,
mm-hmm.
who is a believer.
Yep.
He attends my home church. He's part of my men's Bible study, but I interview celebrities. I interview people in ministry. I interview people in business. Like, I've got an interview coming up soon here. Rachel Barbeau, who is a pioneer, groundbreaking women's sideline sportscaster back in the days when women weren't welcomed onto the sideline. Fascinating interview. 17 years as a sportscaster. Fascinating story that Rachel has. She'll be coming up soon. And now, one other quick thought. I just launched questions and answers with Koloff. So for all your listeners out there, you can email me some messages, koloff.net. Email me some messages, some questions. It can be wrestling related, ministry related, life related. And if you're available, you'll get a personal phone call from me. Wow. And we'll have a 10 to 15 minute conversation highlighting your questions. In fact, I just loaded, I had a guy named Dwayne Soper from Canada. He's a huge fan. I didn't even know I had fans in Canada, Trip. I did a 21 city tour in Canada a few years back, and I met Dwayne and his family. Check this out. He had submitted some questions about suicide. He's like, I don't know if you want to talk about this. I said, bro, let's talk about it. He had a best friend of his 26 years ago that had committed suicide. Dwayne was still struggling with it all these years later, still kind of hurt by it. If people go on and listen to that conversation, especially if they've experienced something like that, I know Dwayne said afterwards that it really helped bring healing to his heart to be able to open up and talk about it.
Yeah.
And so Q&A, questions and answers with Koloff. And I'm just having fun with the podcast, and I appreciate you having me on your podcast.
Yeah, it's like I said, it's incredible stuff that you're doing. You've got your hand in so many different pots. But it's all just remarkable. The things I listened to the 2-part with Sting, and
yeah,
it's great. It is a great podcast. It's great stuff that you're doing. I encourage our listeners to go out there and listen to it. And one of the last questions, well, actually I got 2 last questions for you.
Okay.
Biggest thing you have learned about yourself throughout this entire journey?
Whew, man, that's a whole podcast in itself, Trip. Come on. That's not a 60-second answer. Oh man. The biggest thing I learned about myself. Wow. Honestly, I'm like all of us, we're all on a journey, right? And I look back, I reflect back into the last 25 or so years, and I'm honestly humbled by you said, oh, you got your hands in a lot of things, and I do. It's true, and my view of it is it's not. My attitude is, I can't believe I get to do this.
Yeah,
I can't believe I get to go preach this Sunday. I can't believe I get to go speak at the men's summit on Saturday. I can't believe I get to do a weekly radio show and a podcast that's going to go. By the way, my goal is 100 countries. I want that podcast downloaded into 100 countries. And the plan is to syndicate the radio show to 200 or 300 stations across America. And I can't believe I get to do this. I've become an ambassador for Truth Radio Network, and just recently this week, I came aboard as an ambassador for a ministry in Fort Mill, South Carolina. And so I'm grateful, thankful, humbled at what I get to do, and I guess I recognize it's not. There's a scripture comes to mind, Trip, that says, "Not by might, not by power, but by the Spirit of the Lord." That it's not in and of myself. And let me say this, because this kind of relates to even your question about podcasting, preaching. When I look back at my wrestling career, I flew on airplanes, I rented cars, I stayed in hotels, I talked to microphones in front of cameras. You had asked me, did wrestling help me with the podcast?
Mm-hmm.
It helped me with much more than that. When I look at the ministry, Koloff for Christ Ministries, and what I've done the last 25 years, I'm like, oh, hang on. I've flown on airplanes, I rented cars, I stayed in hotels, I talked to microphones in front of cameras. So wrestling, God's sense of humor, he kind of set me up for my destiny.
Yep.
My destiny. And radio and podcasting has just become a part of that. And so all that to say, to summarize that, to say, what I've learned about myself is God has given me gifts and talents and skills and abilities to do all these things. But I'm quick to remind myself, do not take any credit for any of this. give all the glory and all the credit to God.
Yeah. And you brought up something in there as well that was some advice that I had been told once was, once you start saying, I have to do this, then your goals are all offset. It's, I get to do this. I'm lucky enough. I'm fortunate enough to do this. I get to go to work as opposed to I have to go to work. So I think that's really important.
Right. No, that's a great point because no, you don't. You know, it's like whether you can or you can't. You're right. Oh, I can't do that. Well, you're right. Oh, I can do that. Well, you're right. You're right. It's all in your attitude and your perspective, right?
Yep.
It's not have to or get to. You know, I mean, it's in your perspective of things, and so for sure, that's a great approach to life in and of itself if you take it with that attitude.
Final question for you. 50 years from now, when people mention Nikita Koloff, what do you want them to say about you?
Whew. Wow, you've got some great questions. I'm glad you didn't give me these ahead of time. I didn't know these. Wow. Because I think about when you ask that question, I think about not just people in general, of course, children, grandchildren, great grandchildren. You know, the word legacy is always thrown around. But I hope more than anything, anyone who crossed my path, met me, heard me speak, listened to the show, or, you know, watched me wrestle, or, you know, but watched, more importantly, observed the latter part of my life, would say that it was a man who was absolutely in love with Jesus, who set out at that point to make a difference in everyone's life who he encountered, that when you meet me, you walk away not being impressed by the wrestler Nikita Koloff, but more than anything, by the man who God has molded and shaped me into, and that I become a man of compassion, a man of genuine love for others, and just desiring that they would say, he made a difference. He made a difference.
Yeah, and put kind of a bow on this episode. Where can they find out any and everything about Nikita Koloff?
Oh, thank you. And I know we've mentioned a few things along the way, so we'll just quick reminders for your listeners. So go check out the brand new website, koloff.net, and browse the store and see if there's something there that might bless you or bless somebody you know. And so there's koloff.net. There's also mancamp.info. If you're a man 18 years or older, or you're a gal listening to this and you got a son or a husband or a father or a brother, please share that website with them, mancamp.info. And, you know, we take this small groups of men. We've still got some space for April. Love to meet some guys I hadn't met before who go, hey, I listened to Tripp's podcast and that's how I heard about Man Camp and that's why I'm here. You know, I'd love to meet you and spend some time with you. And then, of course, you know, all the social media platforms. I mean, Twitter, Instagram, Nikita Koloff with the numeral 1 behind it. That's me. Facebook, look for me standing in a river with 2 other guys. Those guys in the river is Ted DiBiase and another friend named Jason Sanderson. It's actually the Jordan River in Israel.
Wow.
We were taking turns baptizing each other in the Jordan. And so that's the real me on Facebook. And then go download the podcast and please subscribe and spread the word and listen and leave a review and let me know how you like it, and send in your questions and let's have a conversation and get you up on Q&A with Koloff. So there you go.
Yeah, I always say we're like the David Hasselhoff of podcast, our show, because we're really popular overseas. So give him some listeners and some subscribers overseas as well. Sir, thank you for doing this. I was a huge fan of the wrestler growing up, but I am an even bigger fan of the person. that I've been fortunate enough to encounter today. So thank you for taking time to join us here today.
Thank you, and blessings to you and all your family, and again, just I want all those out in the military world to know that you are in my prayers, and I don't just say that. If I tell you I'm praying for you, then you can take that to the bank. I really am. It's not just a little cliche. Oh, praying for you. Just know I'm praying for your safety wherever you're at in the world. As you don that uniform. You are, at least from one person, you are being covered and bathed in prayer, and thank you all of you for serving our great nation.
Well, thank you. And folks, that is going to conclude this episode of the Shadows Podcast.